The air in the Forbidden City was heavy, thick with the scent of old wood and the distant, unseen aroma of jasmine from the imperial gardens. But beneath these familiar layers lay a profound, unsettling stillness. It was the hush that settles over a stage just before the final curtain, a silence so complete it felt like a presence all its own. Inside the vast, ornate halls, a different kind of quiet reigned, one filled not with peace, but with the rustle of silk robes and the soft, hurried whispers of eunuchs and ministers. The Dowager Empress Chixi sat upon her throne, a figure both monumental and frail, her shadow stretching long across the polished floor. The flickering oil lamps cast dancing golden light upon the intricate carvings and painted dragons, making them seem to writhe in sympathy with the nation's unease. Outside the walls, the world was changing with a brutal speed the ancient empire couldn't match. Railways snaked across the landscape, not as a symbol of progress, but as veins for foreign influence, while distant cannon fire echoed a relentless demand for concessions and control. The great dragon throne, which had stood for centuries, now seemed to wobble precariously on its foundation. It was the twilight of a dynasty, a slow, fading sunset that painted the skies with shades of both beauty and decay. The Qing dynasty, established by the Manchu people, had ruled over China for more than 250 years, a period that saw periods of immense prosperity and expansion. But by the late 19th century, the old ways were showing their age. The emperors seemed to have lost their grip on the grand, complicated puzzle of governance. They were still at the center of a vast country, but the rest of the world was catching up and then roaring past. It was like trying to navigate a sleek, modern superhighway in an antique horse-drawn carriage. The Qing court, with its intricate rituals and deeply ingrained traditions, found itself ill-equipped to deal with the demands of a new global order, defined by industrial power and military might. The British had already forced their way in during the Opium Wars, leaving a permanent scar and an addiction that bled the country of its resources. This wasn't a one-off event. It was the start of a series of humiliations. The Sino-French War and the Sino-Japanese War of 1894-1895 further exposed the weakness of the once mighty empire. Japan, a small island nation that China had long viewed as a junior sibling, had modernized with astonishing speed and now delivered a shocking military defeat. It was a wake-up call, but the dynasty seemed to hit the snooze button. Foreign powers, smelling weakness like a pack of wolves, began to carve out their own spheres of influence. The French had their foothold in the south, the Germans in Shandong, the British in the Yangtze Valley, and the Russians in the north. They were not subtle about it. They built churches, railways, and factories, all symbols of their growing power and a constant reminder to the Chinese people that their sovereignty was a thing of the past. The treaties signed with these nations were known as unequal treaties, a name that was not an exaggeration. They forced China to open its ports, surrender territory, and pay massive indemnities. Meanwhile, inside the country, the Qing government was struggling to maintain order. The Taiping Rebellion, one of the deadliest conflicts in human history, had raged for over a decade, killing millions and leaving a landscape of devastation and distrust. It was a sign that the people were losing faith in their rulers, and the dynasty's legitimacy was eroding like a sandcastle in the tide. This period, often called the Hundred Years of Humiliation by later Chinese historians, was a time of immense internal and external pressure. The government tried to implement reforms, like the self-strengthening movement, but these were half-hearted and largely ineffective. They were like putting a fresh coat of paint on a house with a crumbling foundation. The Empress Dowager Cixi, a powerful and deeply conservative figure, was often at the center of these struggles. Historians still argue whether her actions were driven by a genuine desire to protect the dynasty or by a stubborn refusal to see the writing on the wall. She was suspicious of reform-minded officials and often preferred to cling to the old ways, a choice that proved to be a fatal one for the dynasty she served. The people, especially the growing intellectual class, began to look for new ideas. They turned to the West, to the very nations that were exploiting them, for concepts of democracy, science, and nationalism. The old Confucian order, with its emphasis on hierarchy and tradition, began to seem less like a source of stability and more like a shackle holding China back. There was a sense of desperation in the air, a feeling that the very identity of the nation was at stake. The imperial court, seemingly unaware of the brewing storm, continued to function in its bubble of ritual and tradition. While officials debated the finer points of ancient poetry, a revolutionary ferment was building outside the city walls. Dissidents and reformers, many of them educated abroad, began to dream of a new China. They saw the country's weakness not as a permanent state, but as a problem to be solved. And they believed the solution lay in completely upending the old system. They spoke of a republic, of a government of the people, and of a nation that could stand shoulder to shoulder with the global powers. This was the moment when the seeds of revolution were planted, a quiet and subtle beginning that would one day erupt into a colossal firestorm. It's funny how the biggest changes often start with the smallest of whispers. The vast, sprawling story of the Chinese Revolution begins not with a bang, but with the quiet rustle of paper in a court that was no longer paying attention to the world around it. The stage was being set, the characters were taking their places, and the old order was about to find out just how heavy the weight of history could be. Before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. We're all just here to relax and maybe learn a little something new, so no pressure at all. As you settle in, maybe you can share in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is for you. It's a little way to feel connected across all the sleepy miles. The stage is ready. The curtains are about to rise on a story that will change a country forever. The whispers of discontent that had been circulating through the capital soon found a more violent expression. It was a movement that emerged from the heartland of China, driven by peasants who felt the sting of foreign encroachment most acutely. They called themselves the Society of Righteous and Harmonious Fists, but to the rest of the world they would become known as the Boxers. The name came from their practice of traditional Chinese martial arts, which they believed made them impervious to foreign bullets. It was a potent mix of desperation, nationalism, and superstition. They were a bit like a grassroots superhero team, except their superpowers were mostly in their heads, and their fight was against an enemy with actual machine guns. The Boxers saw the foreign presence as the source of all their troubles, the droughts, the floods, the poverty. They lashed out against Christian missionaries and Chinese converts, whom they saw as agents of the foreign devils. Their slogan, "Support the Qing, exterminate the foreigners," was a powerful rallying cry that both appealed to the court and put it in a very awkward position. The Qing government, particularly the Empress Dowager Cixi, was initially caught between a rock and a hard place. On one hand, she saw the Boxers as a potential tool to rid the country of the foreign powers that were humiliating her dynasty. On the other hand, a full-blown peasant rebellion was the last thing she wanted. For a time, she tried to play both sides, secretly encouraging the Boxers while publicly condemning them. But the movement's momentum was too strong to be controlled. The Boxers began to lay siege to foreign legations in Beijing, trapping diplomats, missionaries, and their families inside. The situation was tense and incredibly dangerous. Imagine being stuck in a small compound with no way out, surrounded by thousands of angry people who believe you are the source of all evil. It was not a pleasant holiday destination. This act of aggression, a direct challenge to the great powers, was the final straw. It was as if the Qing dynasty had finally decided to light a match and toss it into a powder keg. The international community was not about to stand by and watch. 8 nations, Britain, France, the United States, Russia, Germany, Japan, Austria-Hungary, and Italy, formed a joint military force, the 8-Nation Alliance, to march on Beijing and rescue their citizens. It was a swift and brutal response. The Alliance's soldiers, armed with modern rifles and machine guns, cut a path through the countryside and easily defeated the Boxer forces. The myth of invincibility was shattered in a hail of gunfire, and the Boxers' bravery proved no match for modern technology. The foreign troops then occupied Beijing, and the Empress Dowager Cixi and the imperial court fled, leaving the capital to the mercy of the invaders. This period of occupation was marked by looting and a profound sense of shame for the Chinese people. The foreign soldiers, in seeing China as a backward, lawless land, took whatever they wanted. It was a final, devastating blow to the prestige of the Qing dynasty. The aftermath of the Boxer Rebellion was a political and financial disaster for the Qing government. They were forced to sign the Boxer Protocol, another unequal treaty that imposed a staggering indemnity, a massive payment that would take years to pay off. They also had to allow foreign troops to be permanently stationed in Beijing to protect the legations. It was an ultimate sign of subservience. The rebellion had not only failed to expel the foreigners, but had instead deepened China's humiliation and weakened the central government even more. The Qing dynasty was now a ghost of its former self, a hollowed-out institution propped up by foreign powers that saw no one else to deal with. The Boxer Rebellion proved to many Chinese intellectuals and a growing number of the population that the old ways were no longer viable and that a complete change was needed. The court, having lost what little credibility it had left, made a last-ditch effort to implement reforms, like creating a new army and a modern school system, but it was too little, too late. The Boxer Rebellion is a fascinating moment because it reveals a powerful sense of nationalism, even if it was misguided and steeped in mysticism. Historians still argue whether Cixie's support for the Boxers was a shrewd political gamble or a moment of extreme desperation. Regardless, it was a move that sealed the dynasty's fate. The rebellion and its crushing defeat showed that reform from within was not going to be enough. The time for a new kind of revolution, one that sought not to save the dynasty but to end it, was fast approaching. This sense of impending doom and the need for radical change led many young Chinese to look for new leaders and new ideas. The stage was set for figures like Sun Yat-sen, who had been watching from afar to make their move. The quiet hum of intellectual discourse was about to turn into a roar of revolutionary fervor. The Boxers, in their own way, had cleared the path for the real revolutionaries, even if they hadn't meant to. Their failure was the ultimate proof that the old dynasty was incapable of defending the nation. The country was like a ship taking on water, and the passengers were finally realizing that the captain had no plan to save them. The ship was sinking, and the lifeboats were suddenly looking very appealing to everyone. The time for dreaming was over. The time for action was about to begin. While the Qing court was struggling with the consequences of the Boxer rebellion, a different kind of revolution was brewing far from the imperial capital. Its architect was Sun Yat-sen, a man who had seen the decline of China firsthand, but refused to accept it as inevitable. He was a fascinating character, a trained doctor who spent more time treating the nation's political ailments than its physical ones. Sun had a global education, traveling to Hong Kong, Japan, Europe, and the United States. He wasn't your typical revolutionary, not a man of the battlefield, but a man of ideas. He was a walking symbol of China's future, a blend of traditional Chinese values and modern Western thought. He believed that the only way to save China was to get rid of the monarchy altogether and replace it with a republic. This was a radical notion, something that would have been unthinkable just a few decades earlier. It was like suggesting the sky wasn't blue. Sun Yat-sen's ideas were based on what he called the three principles of the people: nationalism, democracy, and the people's livelihood. The nationalism part was about getting rid of foreign imperialism and uniting all the ethnic groups of China under a single national identity. The democracy part was about establishing a republican government with elections and a constitution, an idea inspired by Western political systems. And the people's livelihood principle was a kind of proto-socialist idea aimed at creating a more equitable society and improving the lives of ordinary citizens. It was a comprehensive plan, a blueprint for a new China. Sun wasn't just talking about a change in government, he was talking about a total societal overhaul. His early attempts at revolution were, to put it gently, a bit of a mixed bag. He and his followers launched several small, failed uprisings. They were often poorly planned, underfunded, and quickly crushed by the Qing authorities. It was a lot of small explosions that just fizzled out. For the Qing government, Sun Yat-sen was a nuisance, a bandit, and a foreign-educated troublemaker. He spent most of his time in exile, traveling the world, raising money from overseas Chinese communities, and building a network of like-minded revolutionaries. He founded several secret societies and political groups, but the most important one was the Tongmenghui, or the Chinese United League, which was established in Japan in 1905. This organization brought together various revolutionary factions and became the central nervous system of the anti-Qing movement. The Tongmenghui was a secret society, and its members operated in the shadows. They smuggled weapons, published revolutionary newspapers, and tried to rally support from Chinese students, intellectuals, and military officers who were disillusioned with the Qing dynasty. It was a classic cloak and dagger operation. They were planting the seeds of rebellion in every corner of China, waiting for the right moment for them to sprout. A key figure in this period was a young military officer named Chiang Kai-shek, who at the time was studying in Japan and was a member of Sun's party. He was a bit hot-headed, but he was fiercely loyal to Sun's vision, a loyalty that would one day be tested in ways he could not have imagined. The revolutionary movement gained momentum as the Qing dynasty continued to stumble. The Empress Dowager Cixi died in 1908, followed shortly by the young emperor. This left the country in the hands of a 5-year-old child emperor, Pu Yi, and a regency council that was even more clueless than Cixi had been. The court's authority was now a joke. The final blow came in 1911 when the Qing government, desperate for funds, announced it would nationalize the railways. This seemed reasonable enough, but in reality, it was a way to transfer control of lucrative railway projects from local gentry and merchants to foreign banks. It was a move that sparked widespread protests, known as the Railway Protection Movement. It was the moment where local elites, who had long been the backbone of the imperial system, finally turned against the court. These protests created a ripple effect, and the revolutionary moment that Sun Yat-sen and his followers had been waiting for finally arrived. It's a great example of how a seemingly small event can trigger a much larger one. Historians still argue whether the 1911 revolution would have happened without the railway protection movement, but it certainly provided the spark that lit the revolutionary fuse. Sun Yat-sen, at the time, was not even in China. He was in America, traveling and raising funds, which is a bit of a punchline when you think about it. The revolution started without the main revolutionary. It's like a band's greatest hit being written while the lead singer is out for a sandwich. The stage was set, and the stagehands were about to take over the show. The revolution was about to begin, not with a carefully planned strike, but with a happy accident. The spark that lit the fuse of the revolution came not from a planned attack, but from a rather mundane military incident in the city of Wuchang. In October of 1911, a revolutionary group was preparing to launch an uprising. They were a bit disorganized, and things were not going according to plan. A small bomb, a device that was supposed to be a tool of liberation, accidentally exploded in one of their hideouts. This wasn't a planned detonation. It was a pure, unadulterated mistake. The explosion, while minor, drew the attention of the local authorities, who raided the hideout and found a list of revolutionaries. This simple accident set off a chain reaction that would topple an empire. It's funny how history can turn on the smallest of errors. The discovery of the list of names sent a wave of panic through the local revolutionary cells. They knew they had to act immediately before the authorities could arrest them all. On October 10th, 1911, a group of soldiers in the new army, who had secretly been converted to the revolutionary cause, decided to launch their uprising a few days ahead of schedule. They raised the revolutionary flag, a white sun on a blue field, and quickly took control of the city of Wuchang. The success of the uprising was a shock to everyone, including the revolutionaries themselves. The Qing officials in the city, taken completely by surprise, fled in disarray. The swift and relatively bloodless victory was a major morale boost for the revolutionary cause and a major blow to the Qing dynasty's already fragile authority. The news of the Wuchang uprising spread like wildfire across China. Province after province, sensing the weakness of the central government and the changing tides, declared their independence from the Qing dynasty. It was like a game of dominoes. Within a few weeks, 15 provinces had broken away from imperial rule. The rebellion was not a coordinated national effort. It was a series of local uprisings, each one inspired by the success of the last. It showed that the old loyalties were gone and the people were ready for something new. The young emperor, Pu Yi, was just a boy, and the Regency Council was in chaos. They were trying to put out fires with gasoline. The Qing dynasty's response was a mix of confusion and desperation. They turned to their most capable military general, Yuan Shikai, a man who had been exiled by the court, but was now their only hope. The revolutionaries, having won an unexpected victory, found themselves in a difficult position. They had a revolution, but they didn't have a clear leader or a central government. Many of the revolutionary leaders were still abroad, including Sun Yat-sen. They needed a figurehead, and they needed to create a new political structure. In December of 1911, Sun Yat-sen returned to China and was elected the provisional president of the new Republic of China. He was the perfect choice for the job. He was a symbol of the revolution and a man with a vision for the future. The provisional government was established in Nanjing, and it drafted a provisional constitution based on Sun's 3 principles of the people. For the first time in China's long history, a republic was born. However, the new republic faced a major challenge in the north, where Yuan Shikai held immense military power. Yuan had a well-trained and loyal army, the Boyang Army, and he was a master of political maneuvering. He was a classic strongman, someone who played by his own rules. Sun Yat-sen and the revolutionaries in the south knew that they couldn't defeat Yuan's army on the battlefield. They were a new, untested government, and they didn't have the resources for a protracted civil war. So, a negotiation began. It was a high-stakes poker game, and Sun Yat-sen knew he had to play his cards carefully. In the end, a compromise was reached. Sun Yat-sen agreed to step down as provisional president and hand the position over to Yuan Shikai. In return, Yuan would force the child emperor, Pu Yi, to abdicate, officially ending the Qing dynasty. It was a pragmatic decision, but also a dangerous one. Sun Yat-sen and his followers believed that by giving up power, they could save the revolution and avoid a devastating civil war. On February 12, 1912, the Qing dynasty officially abdicated, ending more than 2,000 years of imperial rule in China. It was a monumental moment, the end of a long, long chapter in Chinese history. The revolution, which had started with a bomb and a list of names, had finally succeeded. The last emperor, Pu Yi, was allowed to live in the Forbidden City for a time, a living museum of a past that was already a fading memory. He was given a pension, which is a pretty good retirement package for a man who used to rule an empire. But the peace was a fragile one. The man who now held the reins of power, Yuan Shikai, had no intention of being a puppet president. He had his own plans, and they did not involve democracy. With the Qing dynasty officially gone, a new era dawned, but it was not the peaceful, democratic republic that Sun Yat-sen had envisioned. The man now in charge, Yuan Shikai, was an ambitious and cunning general, not a humble public servant. He was a man of power, not principles. Yuan had agreed to be the provisional president, but he had no intention of sharing power or upholding the new constitution. He quickly moved the capital from Nanjing back to Beijing, placing himself in the old seat of imperial power. This was a clear sign of his intentions, a subtle but significant move that showed he was more interested in being an emperor than a president. The revolutionaries, many of them members of the new Nationalist Party, or the Kuomintang, watched with a growing sense of alarm. Yuan Shikai's rule began with a series of power grabs. He systematically weakened the newly established parliamentary system. He ignored the provisional constitution, dismissed elected officials, and had his political opponents, including the popular Song Jiaoren, a key leader of the Kuomintang, assassinated. Song's murder was a turning point. It exposed Yuan's true nature and shattered any lingering hopes that he would be a benevolent leader. It was a brutal move that proved the old ways of violence and intrigue were not gone, just wearing a new mask. The Kuomintang, led by Sun Yat-sen from his self-imposed exile, tried to launch a second revolution in 1913, but it was a dismal failure. Yuan's powerful Beiyang army quickly crushed the rebellion. The dream of a democratic republic seemed to be fading almost as soon as it had begun. With the Kuomintang scattered and the parliament dissolved, Yuan Shikai ruled China as a military dictator. He had the military, and in this chaotic period, that was all that mattered. He began to consolidate his power, a move that culminated in his most audacious plan, to make himself the new emperor of China. He saw himself as the only one who could bring stability and order to the fractured nation, and he believed the people yearned for the return of a strong ruler. He even started to perform the ancient Confucian rituals once reserved for the emperor, a clear signal of his intentions. He had the support of his generals and the backing of some foreign powers who preferred a strong ruler to the chaos of a fledgling republic. But his ambition was a step too far. In 1915, Yuan Shikai formally announced his plan to restore the monarchy and declare himself emperor. He set a date for his coronation, a grand ceremony that was meant to usher in a new dynasty. But this time, he miscalculated. The move sparked widespread outrage across the country. Many of the provincial military governors who had been loyal to him now turned against him. They were fine with him being a powerful dictator, but the idea of a new emperor was too much. It was a rejection of the 1911 revolution and all the hopes that had come with it. The intellectuals and students who had championed the Republican cause were horrified. A number of provinces declared their independence from his rule, and a new civil war, called the National Protection War, broke out. Yuan Shikai found himself in an impossible position. He was a man with a great army, but no popular support. The rebellion grew, and even his most loyal generals urged him to step down. He had gone from the savior of the nation to a desperate and isolated figure. His dream of a new dynasty turned into a complete nightmare. In March 1916, just a few months after announcing his plan, Yuan Shikai was forced to abandon his imperial ambitions. He formally renounced the throne, but the damage was already done. He had lost the trust of the nation and the loyalty of his army. A few months later, in June 1916, he died, reportedly of uremia, but many historians believe his death was hastened by his failed ambition and immense stress. The death of Yuan Shikai did not bring peace. In fact, it made things much, much worse. He had held the country together, however tenuously, with the force of his personality and his army. With him gone, a power vacuum was created. There was no single figure strong enough to take his place. The country, which had just experienced a failed monarchy and a failed republic, was about to enter a new period of chaos. It was a time of warlords, a time when regional military leaders would carve out their own personal kingdoms and fight for control of the country. The Chinese Revolution, which had begun with so much hope, was about to descend into its most fragmented and violent phase yet. The story of the Chinese Revolution is often thought of as a simple nationalist versus communist story, but the decade that followed Yuan's death reminds us that the story is far more complex and chaotic. With Yuan Shikai's death, the great unwieldy ship of China was left without a captain, and it immediately began to break apart. The central government in Beijing still existed in name, but it had no real authority. The power was now in the hands of regional military commanders, men who were once Yuan's subordinates, but now saw an opportunity to become kings in their own right. This new period was known as the Warlord Era, and it was a time of immense political fragmentation and civil strife. It was as if all the provinces decided to have their own little country, each with its own army, its own currency, and its own rules. The warlords were a motley crew of generals, former bandits, and provincial governors, each with their own personal fiefdom. They were a bit like medieval feudal lords, but with more modern weapons. The warlords fought constantly over territory, resources, and power. They formed and broke alliances with a speed that would make your head spin. A friend one day could be a mortal enemy the next. Their armies were a mix of professional soldiers, conscripted peasants, and outright bandits. The fighting was brutal and chaotic, and it was the Chinese people who suffered the most. The warlords imposed heavy taxes on the populace to fund their endless wars, often extorting money from peasants and merchants. The economy was in shambles. The constant fighting disrupted trade and transportation, and inflation ran rampant. The Chinese people, who had endured a dying dynasty and a failed republic, now had to deal with a new kind of misery. It was a time of deep-seated despair, a feeling that the country had lost its way completely. The Warlord Era was not just about military conflict. It was also a time of political theater. Different warlords would vie for control of the central government in Beijing, not because they cared about the nation, but because it gave them a veneer of legitimacy and access to foreign loans. They would install puppet presidents and cabinets, but these governments were powerless. their authority extending only as far as the city limits. This created a situation where China was officially a republic, but in reality was a collection of warring states. The major powers of the world, like the United States, Britain, and Japan, watched with a mix of concern and opportunism. They would often back different warlords, supplying them with weapons and money, hoping to gain an advantage in the chaos. It was a classic example of foreign interference, a kind of geopolitical game of chess where China was the board. Amidst this chaos, the two major political forces that would one day fight for control of China were starting to take shape. In the south, Sun Yat-sen and the Kuomintang, the Nationalist Party, were trying to rebuild their revolutionary government in Guangzhou. They were not a military powerhouse, but they had a powerful symbol, the dream of a unified, modern, and democratic China. Sun Yat-sen, who had once given up power for the sake of peace, was now a voice of resistance against the warlords. He still believed in his three principles of the people, and he was determined to see them realized. However, the Kuomintang itself was a bit of a mixed bag. It was a coalition of different factions and interests, and it lacked a strong central army. It was a bit like a sports team that had a great coach, but no star players. The other major force, still in its infancy, was the Chinese Communist Party. It hadn't even been officially formed yet, but the ideas that would create it were starting to circulate. This period of intellectual ferment, fueled by the chaos of the Warlord Era, was a time of intense searching for a new path. Many young intellectuals looked at the West and saw its problems, the Great War, the social inequality, and began to turn to other ideas. The Russian Revolution of 1917 was a major inspiration. It showed that a group of determined revolutionaries, using a new ideology, could take over a vast country. It was a powerful message to a generation that felt completely lost. The Warlord Era was a dark and violent chapter in Chinese history. It was a period that showed just how fragile the new republic was, and how deeply ingrained the forces of disunity were. It was a time of suffering for the people and a time of searching for a new solution for the intellectuals. It was a story of a country that was trying to find its way out of the past and into the future, but kept getting tripped up by its own internal conflicts. The stage was being set for the next, much bigger, act of the Chinese Revolution, a conflict that would pit not just regional generals against each other, but two great ideologies. The calm, which never really was about to be shattered completely. Amidst the chaos of the Warlord Era, a new intellectual and cultural movement began to take shape, a peaceful rebellion that sought to redefine what it meant to be Chinese. This was the New Culture movement, a period of intense intellectual ferment that began around 1915 and peaked in the years that followed. It wasn't about armies or battles, it was about words and ideas. It was a group of scholars and students who looked at China's decline and concluded that the problem wasn't just political, but cultural. They believed that the old ways, particularly the rigid traditions of Confucianism, were holding the country back. They felt that China was like a person wearing ancient, heavy robes who was trying to run a modern marathon. It just wasn't going to work. The movement's leaders, many of them educated in the West, called for a complete overhaul of traditional Chinese values. They argued for the adoption of modern, Western-inspired ideas like democracy, science, and individualism. They wanted to replace the old with the new, and they believed that the only way to do that was to dismantle the very foundations of Chinese society. They were a bit like a group of cultural renovators, knocking down walls and tearing up floors in an old grand house. A key figure was Chen Duxiu, a brilliant scholar who founded the magazine New Youth, which became the unofficial mouthpiece of the movement. He called for a complete break with the past, famously writing, "If we wish to build a new nation, we must first have a new youth." One of the most radical aspects of the New Culture movement was its attack on the traditional Chinese language. For centuries, educated Chinese people had used classical Chinese, a literary language that was difficult to learn and far removed from the spoken language of the common person. The New Culture intellectuals argued that this was a major barrier to mass literacy and modernization. They advocated for the use of vernacular Chinese in writing, a move that would eventually transform Chinese literature and education. It was a revolutionary idea, and it helped to spread new ideas to a much wider audience. It was like suddenly deciding to write all formal documents in everyday slang. A bit of a shock, but it worked. Another key event of this period was the May 4th movement in 1919. This was a student protest in Beijing against the Treaty of Versailles, which had ended World War I. The Chinese people had hoped that the treaty would force the Japanese to return Chinese territories they had seized during the war, particularly in Shandong province. But instead, the treaty awarded the territories to Japan. This was seen as a betrayal by the Western powers and a further humiliation for China. Thousands of students took to the streets in protest, and the movement quickly spread to other cities, bringing together merchants, workers, and intellectuals. The May 4th movement was a powerful expression of Chinese nationalism and a turning point in the New Culture movement. It showed that the intellectual ideas of the scholars could be turned into real-world political action. The New Culture movement, and especially the May 4th movement, had a profound impact on Chinese society. It opened the door to a wide range of new ideas, from liberalism and anarchism to socialism and communism. It created a generation of young, politically engaged intellectuals who were looking for a way to save their country. This period also saw a flowering of Chinese literature, with authors like Lu Xun writing powerful stories that criticized traditional society and explored the problems of modern China. The movement's legacy is still felt today, as it laid the groundwork for the intellectual and political debates that would shape the rest of the 20th century. It's important to remember that the New Culture movement was not a single, unified group with one clear agenda. It was a wide-ranging, chaotic, and often contradictory movement. Some intellectuals favored liberal democracy, while others were drawn to more radical ideas. The movement's critique of the past also led to a debate about China's future. Was the country to abandon its history completely in favor of the West, or could it find a third way? Historians still argue about the true legacy of the movement. Was it a necessary step toward modernization, or did it cut China off from its own cultural roots? The movement, in its way, was a quiet, intellectual counterpoint to the violent chaos of the Warlord Era. It was a time when minds, not just armies, were fighting for the future of China. The ideas sown during this period would one day lead to the birth of a new, powerful political force. The intellectual ferment of the New Culture movement and the inspiration of the Russian Revolution had a powerful and direct result. In July 1921, a small group of revolutionaries meeting secretly in Shanghai founded the Chinese Communist Party, or the CCP. The meeting was a quiet, unassuming affair, held in the French concession to avoid the prying eyes of the police and the warlords. It was a meeting of a dozen or so men, many of them young students and scholars, who were deeply disillusioned with the state of China and convinced that only a radical, new ideology could save it. They weren't soldiers or politicians in the traditional sense. They were intellectuals, driven by ideas and a passionate belief that China needed a total transformation. The founding of the CCP was directly influenced by the success of the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia just a few years earlier. The Russian model, which showed how a small group of dedicated revolutionaries could seize power and build a new society, seemed like a perfect fit for China's chaotic situation. The CCP's founders saw in Marxism-Leninism a powerful tool to understand China's problems and a roadmap to a better future. They believed that the country was suffering under a combination of foreign imperialism and internal feudalism, and that a revolution, led by the working class, was the only solution. The party's early membership was small, but it included some of the most influential intellectuals of the time, including Chen Duxiu, who we talked about before, and a young man who had once worked as a librarian's assistant in Beijing, a fellow named Mao Zedong. Mao Zedong was a fascinating and complex figure from the very beginning. He was a peasant from a rural village in Hunan province, and he brought a unique perspective to the party. While many of the early CCP leaders were focused on the urban working class, the proletariat, as the engine of the revolution, Mao had a deep understanding of the immense power and potential of the Chinese peasantry. This was a crucial difference, a thought that would one day change the course of the revolution. Mao believed that the peasants, who made up the vast majority of the Chinese population, were not just a passive force, but the true revolutionary class. This idea would become the cornerstone of his revolutionary strategy, but at the time, it was a fringe belief within the party. The early years of the CCP were not easy. The party was constantly under threat from the warlords and the various governments that claimed to rule China. Its members had to operate in secret, organizing labor unions and student movements, trying to build a base of support in the cities. They were a bit like a small startup, trying to compete with a bunch of huge, established corporations that also happened to have armies. They were learning the ropes as they went along, making mistakes, and slowly building their network. The party also received support from the Comintern, the Communist International, an organization based in Moscow that was dedicated to spreading communism around the world. The Comintern provided the CCP with guidance, funding, and a direct link to the Russian model. The founding of the CCP was a quiet but incredibly significant moment in Chinese history. It marked the arrival of a new, powerful ideology that would one day challenge both the Nationalist Party and the old warlords. The party's initial goals were modest: to organize the working class and spread the word of communism, but its long-term ambitions were monumental. The CCP's existence also meant that the Chinese Revolution was no longer just a struggle between rival military generals and political factions. It was now a struggle between two competing visions for China's future. One, championed by Sun Yat-sen's Nationalist Party, was a vision of a modern democratic republic. The other, championed by the fledgling Communist Party, was a vision of a new socialist society based on the ideas of Marx and Lenin. The stage was being set for a colossal ideological and military struggle, a contest that would define the rest of the 20th century in China. The peaceful intellectual debates of the New Culture movement had given birth to a political party that was ready to fight for its beliefs. The quiet beginning of the party belied the incredible power it would one day wield. The Warlord Era was proving to be a political and military puzzle that neither the Kuomintang nor the Communists could solve on their own. The country was too fragmented, the warlords too numerous, and the task of reunification too vast. Seeing this, the Soviet Union, under the guidance of its new leader, Vladimir Lenin, and the Communist International, or Comintern, saw an opportunity. They believed that the only way for the Chinese Revolution to succeed was for the two major revolutionary forces to join together. This idea was not welcomed by everyone. It was a deeply pragmatic and, at times, a very awkward proposal. In 1923, a surprising alliance was formed between Sun Yat-sen's Kuomintang and the fledgling Chinese Communist Party. This was known as the First United Front. The two parties that had very different ideologies. One was nationalist and the other was communist, but they had a common enemy: the warlords who were tearing the country apart. The alliance was based on a simple, shared goal: to defeat the warlords, end the foreign imperialism, and unify China under a central government. The Comintern played a crucial role, urging the CCP to join the Kuomintang. They believed that the CCP, which was still very small, could grow its influence by working within the larger, more powerful Nationalist Party. The alliance was not an easy one. Many members of the Kuomintang were deeply suspicious of the Communists, whom they saw as radical and un-Chinese. Likewise, many Communists were wary of the Kuomintang, which they saw as a party of the bourgeoisie and intellectuals. It was a partnership of convenience, a temporary truce in a much larger struggle. The Soviet Union helped to smooth things over by providing both parties with financial aid, military advisors, and political training. They sent military experts to China to help the Kuomintang build a modern army, and they helped to establish the Whampoa Military Academy, a school that would train a new generation of military leaders. A young man named Chiang Kai-shek was put in charge of the academy, and it was here that he began to build a power base of loyal officers, a network that would prove invaluable in the years to come. The alliance had a clear purpose, which was to prepare for a military campaign to unify China. This campaign would become known as the Northern Expedition. But before the expedition could begin, the Kuomintang suffered a major loss. In March 1925, Sun Yat-sen, the great symbol of the revolution, died of liver cancer in Beijing. His death was a monumental blow to the Nationalist Party and to the cause of a united China. He was a man who had held the various factions of the Kuomintang together, and with him gone, a power struggle was inevitable. His final words were, "Peace, struggle, save China," a fitting farewell from a man who had dedicated his life to the cause. The death of Sun Yat-sen created a power vacuum, and the man who was in the best position to fill it was Chiang Kai-shek. He was a military man, a no-nonsense leader who had the loyalty of the new army being trained at Whampoa. He was also a conservative who was deeply suspicious of the communists. He saw them as a threat to his power and to the traditional values he held dear. The alliance was now led by a man who didn't trust his allies. This was like a band with a new lead singer who secretly hated the drummer. It was only a matter of time before things got ugly. Historians still argue about whether Sun Yat-sen was truly a communist sympathizer or a simple pragmatist. His final will, which was heavily influenced by Soviet advisors, urged his followers to continue to work with the communists. But Chiang Kai-shek had other ideas. The First United Front was a testament to how an ideological enemy can become a necessary ally when faced with a common threat. But it also showed that such alliances are fragile and often temporary. The stage was set for the next chapter of the revolution, one that would see the alliance crumble and the true nature of the two parties revealed. The Northern Expedition was about to begin, and it would not only be a war against the warlords, but also a test of the fragile partnership between the nationalists and the communists. With Sun Yat-sen gone and Chiang Kai-shek at the helm, the Kuomintang was ready for its next big step. The time for political maneuvering was over. The time for military action had begun. In the summer of 1926, the Northern Expedition was launched. It was a massive military campaign with a clear and ambitious goal: to defeat the various warlords who controlled the northern half of China and to unify the country under a single central government. The Kuomintang's army, which had been trained by Soviet advisors at the Whampoa Military Academy, was a modern and disciplined force, a far cry from the disorganized militias of the past. It was like a well-oiled machine going up against a bunch of rusty old jalopies. The campaign was a huge success, at least in its early stages. The Kuomintang army, under the command of Chiang Kai-shek, marched northward, winning a series of stunning victories. The warlord armies, which were often poorly equipped and lacked a strong central command, were no match for Chiang's forces. The campaign wasn't just a military one, it was also a political one. The Kuomintang used propaganda to win the hearts and minds of the people, promising to end the suffering caused by the warlords and to bring a new era of peace and stability. The people, who had been brutalized by years of constant fighting and extortion, welcomed the Kuomintang army as liberators. The sight of a unified army marching under a single flag was a powerful symbol of hope for a nation that had been a mess for so long. The Chinese Communist Party, which was a part of the United Front, played a crucial role in the Northern Expedition. While the Kuomintang's army was fighting on the front lines, the communists were working behind the scenes. They organized labor unions and peasant associations, mobilizing popular support for the revolution. They helped to set up local governments in the areas that had been liberated from the warlords, and they used their grassroots networks to disrupt the warlord's supply lines and to gather intelligence. The communists were not just a military force, they were also a social and political one. They were using the opportunity to build their own power base and to spread their revolutionary ideas among the masses. As the Northern Expedition pushed northward, the alliance between the Kuomintang and the CCP began to show its cracks. The two parties had a common enemy, but they had very different visions for the future. The communists were gaining a lot of popular support in the countryside, and their peasant associations were beginning to challenge the power of the local landlords, who were often allies of the Nationalist Party. This made many of the more conservative members of the Kuomintang uneasy. They saw the communists not as an ally but as a dangerous rival, a kind of internal parasite that was growing too big, too fast. The Soviet advisors, who were working with both parties, were trying to keep the alliance together, but the ideological differences were proving to be too great. Chiang Kai-shek, who had emerged as the undisputed leader of the Kuomintang, became increasingly paranoid about the growing influence of the communists. He saw them as a direct threat to his authority and his vision of a unified nationalist China. He believed that the communists were planning to betray the Kuomintang and take over the revolution for themselves. In his mind, he had to act before they did. The moment of truth came when the Northern Expedition captured Shanghai, the most important commercial and industrial city in China. Shanghai was a hub of revolutionary activity with powerful labor unions that were controlled by the communists. This was a place where the communists had a huge power base, and Chiang knew that if he wanted to control the city, he would have to confront them. Historians still argue about whether the Shanghai massacre was a preemptive strike by Chiang Kai-shek or a necessary move to consolidate his power. Regardless of the motivation, the result was a brutal and decisive blow to the alliance. The Northern Expedition was a military success, but it was also a political failure. The two parties that had worked together to defeat the warlords were now on a collision course, and their conflict would lead to a new, much more destructive phase of the Chinese Revolution. The fragile peace was about to be shattered, and the country was about to descend into a new, more ideological and brutal civil war. The Northern Expedition had successfully defeated the warlords, but it had also set the stage for a conflict that would last for more than 2 decades. The triumphant march of the Northern Expedition reached its climax in the spring of 1927. The Nationalist Army, led by Chiang Kai-shek, entered Shanghai, a city humming with revolutionary fervor and communist-led labor unions. The city was a microcosm of the entire Chinese Revolution, a place where the forces of capitalism, foreign imperialism, and communist revolution were all vying for control. Chiang Kai-shek knew that if he wanted to be the true master of China, he had to confront the communists head-on. He couldn't afford to have a rival power base in the nation's most important city. The fragile alliance was about to snap. In April 1927, Chiang Kai-shek ordered a full-scale crackdown on the communists and their sympathizers in Shanghai. The operation was carried out with brutal efficiency. The Nationalist Army, along with local gangsters and anti-communist secret societies, raided communist headquarters, labor unions, and student organizations. They arrested and executed thousands of suspected communists and their allies. The streets of Shanghai, which had been filled with the cheers of a liberated populace, now ran red with blood. The crackdown was a decisive and shocking turn of events. It was a clear and unambiguous signal that the First United Front was over and that the Chinese Civil War had officially begun. The communists, who had been working for years to build their base in the cities, were caught completely by surprise. Their urban networks were destroyed, and their leadership was forced to flee or go into hiding. The Shanghai Massacre, also known as the April 12th incident, was a catastrophic blow to the Chinese Communist Party. The party's leader, Chen Duxiu, who had a more moderate approach and was focused on urban workers, was completely outmaneuvered. The massacre led to a deep crisis within the CCP. They had to figure out how to survive in the face of such a brutal crackdown. The Comintern, which had urged the CCP to work with the Kuomintang, was also left with egg on its face. The Soviet Union, which had been a key backer of the United Front, was now seen as having given the communists a very bad piece of advice. The massacre marked a major shift in the balance of power. The Kuomintang was now the undisputed master of the revolution, and the communists were a hunted and scattered force. After the Shanghai Massacre, Chiang Kai-shek established a new national government in the city of Nanjing. This government was recognized by most of the foreign powers, and it was a symbol of his victory over the warlords and the communists. The period that followed, from 1927 to 1937, would become known as the Nanjing Decade. It was a time of relative stability and economic progress, but it was also a period of immense political repression. Chiang Kai-shek was now a dictator, and he ruled with an iron fist. He was determined to unify China and to build a modern nationalist state, but he was also determined to stamp out any dissent, particularly from the communists. Meanwhile, the remnants of the Chinese Communist Party were forced to change their strategy. The old approach, which was focused on organizing urban workers, was now impossible. They had to find a new way to survive and to fight. It was in this moment of crisis that the ideas of a young peasant from Hunan, Mao Zedong, began to gain traction. Mao had always argued that the revolution should be based not on the urban working class, but on the immense power of the Chinese peasantry. He had been a bit of an outcast in the party, but now his ideas seemed to be the only path forward. He believed that the communists should retreat to the countryside, establish rural base areas, and build a new kind of army, a peasant army. The Shanghai Massacre was a brutal reminder that the Chinese Revolution was not just a story of noble ideals, but also a story of immense violence and betrayal. It showed that the struggle for China's future would not be won in the cities, but in the vast rural landscape that made up the majority of the country. The massacre was a pivotal moment, a dark chapter that forced the communists to go back to the drawing board and to develop a new, more powerful strategy. It was a tragic end to an alliance that had held so much promise, and a brutal beginning to a long and bloody civil war that would last for more than 2 decades. While Chiang Kai-shek was consolidating his power and establishing the new nationalist government in Nanjing, the battered remnants of the Chinese Communist Party were in a very different position. After the brutal purges in Shanghai and other cities, the party was forced to flee the urban centers and find a new place to survive. It was in this moment of desperation that the ideas of Mao Zedong, the young man who had always believed in the power of the peasantry, came to the forefront. He and a small group of followers retreated to the remote mountainous border region of Jiangxi province in the southeast of China. This was a place where the nationalist government's control was weak, a perfect hideout for a fledgling revolutionary army. In Jiangxi, Mao and his comrades began to build a new kind of revolutionary base, one centered not in the industrial cities, but in the rural countryside. They called it the Jiangxi Soviet, a self-governing communist state in the heart of nationalist-controlled territory. It was a bold and audacious experiment. They implemented a radical program of land reform, seizing land from wealthy landlords and distributing it to the poor peasants. This was a revolutionary act that won them immense support from the local population. For the first time, many peasants had their own land to farm, and they were willing to do whatever it took to defend it. They were not just passive supporters, they were active participants in the revolution. The Jiangxi Soviet was more than just a military base. It was a kind of utopian experiment. The communists set up a parallel government, a new currency, and a new legal system. They organized schools, hospitals, and cultural programs. They were trying to create a new society from the ground up, a society based on the principles of communism. Mao Zedong, with his deep understanding of rural life and his brilliant strategic mind, was the clear leader of this new movement. He developed a new form of warfare, known as guerrilla warfare, which was perfectly suited to the terrain and to the small, mobile army he commanded. He and his top general, Zhu Dai, used a strategy that was all about avoiding direct confrontation with the much larger nationalist army. Their tactics were simple but brilliant. The enemy advances, we retreat. The enemy camps, we harass. The enemy tires, we attack. The enemy retreats, we pursue. It was like playing a game of cat and mouse, but the mouse was the one with the home field advantage. The nationalist government in Nanjing could not ignore the growing communist presence in Jiangxi. They saw the Soviet as a direct threat to their authority and a cancer that had to be cut out. Chiang Kai-shek, who was still trying to consolidate his power and deal with the remaining warlords, was determined to destroy the communists once and for all. He launched a series of military campaigns known as the encirclement and suppression campaigns, with the goal of completely surrounding the Jiangxi Soviet and wiping out the communist forces. The first 4 campaigns were a complete failure. The communist guerrilla tactics proved to be incredibly effective. The nationalists, with their superior numbers and firepower, would march into the remote, mountainous terrain, only to be ambushed and defeated by the highly mobile and highly motivated Red Army. The communists had the support of the local population, who acted as spies and provided them with food and supplies. It was a classic example of a small, dedicated force defeating a much larger, more conventional army. Mao's strategy was working perfectly. The Jiangxi Soviet was not just surviving, it was thriving. It was a powerful example of the potential of a peasant-based revolution, an idea that was completely alien to the traditional urban-focused communist movements of the time. The stage was set for a new and much more brutal phase of the Civil War. The Nationalists, having failed 4 times, were about to try a new, more ruthless strategy. After 4 failed attempts to crush the Jiangxi Soviet, Chiang Kai-shek and the nationalist government changed their tactics. They had learned that a direct assault on the mobile and elusive Red Army was a losing game. So for the 5th Encirclement Campaign, they hired a new team of advisors, German military experts, and adopted a different strategy. This time, they would not pursue the communists into the mountains. Instead, they would use a slow, methodical approach, building a series of fortifications, blockhouses, and roads around the Jiangxi Soviet. It was a strategy of slow strangulation, a bit like a boa constrictor, slowly tightening its grip on its prey. The nationalist army, which now numbered almost 1,000,000 men, began to systematically build a network of blockhouses, small concrete forts, in concentric circles around the communist-controlled area. They were not just a military barrier, they were also a political and economic one. The blockhouses cut off the Jiangxi Soviet from the outside world, preventing the Red Army from getting new recruits, food, and supplies. They were also used to terrorize the local population, who had been a key source of support for the communists. The nationalists used a scorched earth policy, burning villages and crops, and executing anyone suspected of being a communist sympathizer. The goal was to drain the sea of people that the fish of the communist army swam in. This new strategy was incredibly effective. The communists, who had been so successful with their guerrilla tactics, were now forced to fight a conventional war. This was a grave mistake. The Chinese Communist Party's leadership, which at the time was heavily influenced by the Comintern's rigid, Soviet-style tactics, ordered the Red Army to abandon Mao Zedong's mobile warfare strategy and instead defend the Soviets' borders in fixed positions. They were trying to fight a modern war with a guerrilla army. It was like trying to win a chess game by using only pawns and insisting they be moved in a straight line. The Red Army was no match for the Nationalists' superior numbers, firepower, and air support. They suffered heavy losses, and the Jiangxi Soviet's territory began to shrink. The communist leaders, who had once been so confident, were now faced with a complete and utter military disaster. By the end of 1934, the situation was untenable. The communist leaders realized that they could not win the war, and that their only option was to break out of the encirclement and find a new base. The decision was made to abandon the Jiangxi Soviet and to begin a long, desperate, and dangerous retreat to the north. This retreat would become known as the Long March. It was a testament to the sheer desperation of the communists, a last-ditch effort to survive in the face of complete annihilation. Mao Zedong, who had been sidelined and stripped of his military command, was now a voice of reason. He had argued against the disastrous decision to fight a conventional war, but his warnings had been ignored. Now, in the face of a complete military collapse, his ideas were starting to look a lot more appealing. The 5th Encirclement Campaign was a major victory for the nationalist government, but it was not a complete one. While they had successfully driven the communists from their base, they had not destroyed the Red Army. The campaign's legacy is a complicated one. It showed that the nationalist government, under Chiang Kai-shek's leadership, was capable of winning a military victory, but it also showed the immense brutality of the Civil War and the deep-seated divisions in Chinese society. For the communists, the campaign was a humbling and catastrophic defeat, but it was also a turning point. It forced them to abandon their old, failed strategies and to embrace a new, more effective way of fighting. The Long March was about to begin, and it would not only be a physical journey, but also a political one, a journey that would put a new leader, Mao Zedong, at the very center of the Chinese Revolution. The retreat from the Jiangxi Soviet, which would become known as the Long March, began in October 1934. It was not a grand military parade, but a desperate, chaotic escape. The communist forces, now a unified group of several armies, broke out of the nationalist encirclement and began a long, grueling trek across the vast, rugged landscape of China. The march was not a single event, but a series of interconnected journeys, with different groups of the Red Army taking different routes. The main group, which included the party's central leadership, was the First Red Army, and its journey is the one most often associated with the Long March. The Long March was a test of endurance and a struggle for survival. The Red Army had to cross vast, desolate plains, treacherous mountains, and raging rivers, all while being pursued and harassed by the nationalist forces. The weather was a constant enemy, with soldiers facing freezing snow and blistering heat. They had to fight not only the nationalists, but also the local warlords, who saw them as invaders. Food and supplies were always scarce, and many soldiers died of starvation, exhaustion, and disease. It was an epic journey, a story of incredible hardship and immense sacrifice. The number of soldiers who began the march was around 86,000, but by the time they reached their destination, less than a year later, only about 7,000 remained. Despite the hardship, the Long March was a pivotal moment for the Chinese Communist Party. It was during this journey that a new leader, Mao Zedong, rose to the top. At the beginning of the march, Mao had been a minor figure, a man who had been sidelined by the party's leadership. But his ideas about guerrilla warfare and his unique understanding of the Chinese peasantry began to look a lot more appealing. He was one of the few leaders who had been right about the disastrous decision to fight a conventional war against the nationalists. He was a master of political maneuvering, a man who knew how to use a crisis to his advantage. The turning point came in January 1935, when the party's central leadership held a meeting in the city of Zunyi. This was a crucial moment, a conference that would change the course of the Chinese Revolution. At the Zunyi conference, the party leaders openly and honestly discussed their failures during the Fifth Encirclement campaign. They blamed the defeat on the rigid, Soviet-style tactics of the party's leadership and the failed decision to fight a conventional war. Mao Zedong, who had been a critic of these tactics from the beginning, was a voice of reason. He was eloquent and persuasive, and his arguments resonated with the party members who had just endured a catastrophic military defeat. At the end of the conference, Mao Zedong was elected to a leadership position in the party. While he was not yet the undisputed leader, his rise to power was a major turning point. The party formally abandoned the old, failed strategies and adopted Mao's approach of mobile warfare and guerrilla tactics. This was a huge shift, a kind of cultural and political revolution within the party itself. The Zunyi Conference was a victory for Mao and for his ideas, and it set him on a path to becoming the most powerful man in the Chinese Communist Party. The Long March continued, but it was now a march with a new leader and a new direction. The journey, which had begun as a desperate retreat, was now a symbol of the party's resilience and its determination to survive. The Long March was more than just a military retreat. It was a political triumph for Mao Zedong, a journey that would establish his authority and cement his place in the history of the Chinese Revolution. The Long March, a desperate flight for survival, had a pivotal moment that forever changed the course of the Chinese Revolution. It wasn't a battle or a political victory. It was an internal meeting held in January 1935 in the small mountain town of Zunyi. The Communist Party's leadership was in disarray. Their military strategy had been a complete and utter failure, and they were now a hunted and scattered force. They were like a football team that had just lost a major game and was now having a very honest, very painful locker room discussion. At the Zunyi Conference, the party leaders had to confront their failures. The blame for the disastrous Fifth Encirclement campaign was squarely placed on the shoulders of the so-called twilight Bolsheviks, a group of young, Soviet-trained leaders who had been in charge of the military. They had insisted on fighting a rigid, conventional war against the nationalists, a strategy that had cost the Red Army dearly. Mao Zedong, who had been a critic of this strategy from the beginning, was now a voice of reason. He had been a low-ranking officer at the start of the Long March, but his tactical insights and his unwavering belief in a peasant-based revolution were now looking a lot more appealing. He and his key ally, Zhu Dai, argued that the party had to abandon the failed Soviet model and return to the guerrilla warfare tactics that had worked so well in the past. Mao's arguments were persuasive. He had a brilliant mind and a deep understanding of the Chinese landscape and the Chinese people. He was not just a military tactician, he was a political strategist. He argued that the party's future lay not in the cities, which were controlled by the nationalists, but in the vast countryside, where the peasants were waiting to be mobilized. His ideas were a complete break from the traditional communist orthodoxy, which held that the urban working class was the true engine of the revolution. But in the face of a complete military disaster, the party leaders were willing to listen to a new voice. The Zunyi Conference was not a sudden power grab by Mao Zedong. He was not yet the undisputed leader of the party, but he was given a much more prominent role. He was named to the Standing Committee of the Politburo, and he was given the authority to make key military decisions. The conference was a turning point, a moment when the party formally rejected its old, failed strategies and adopted a new, more effective way of fighting. It was a victory for Mao's ideas and a testament to his ability to use a moment of crisis to his advantage. The party's new strategy was a simple but brilliant one: to avoid direct confrontation with the nationalists, to use guerrilla tactics to harass their forces, and to win the support of the local population. It was a strategy of hitting where the enemy is weak and living among the people. The Long March continued, but it was now a different kind of journey. It was a journey with a new leader and a new direction. The Red Army, now under the guidance of Mao Zedong, began to move with a renewed sense of purpose. They were still being pursued by the nationalists, but they were now fighting a much smarter war. They used a combination of deception, rapid movement, and ambushes to evade and defeat their enemies. The journey, which had started as a desperate escape, was now a powerful symbol of the Communist Party's resilience and its determination to survive. The Long March was a story of a small, dedicated force that against all odds managed to survive and to find a new path forward. Historians still argue about the true significance of the Zunyi Conference. Some see it as the moment when Mao Zedong's genius was finally recognized, while others see it as a more gradual process. But there is no doubt that the conference was a pivotal moment. It was a political triumph for Mao Zedong and a crucial step in his rise to power. The Long March, which was a military disaster, was also a political victory for the man who would one day rule China. As the Long March continued its brutal journey, the Chinese Communist Party was an army on the run, but a new, much larger threat was looming on the horizon. The Japanese Empire, which had long harbored imperial ambitions in China, was becoming increasingly aggressive. In 1931, Japan had already invaded and occupied Manchuria, a vast and resource-rich region in northeastern China. The nationalist government under Chiang Kai-shek was too focused on the civil war with the communists to mount a significant resistance. He believed that the communists were the bigger, more immediate threat, a cancer of the soul, while the Japanese were a skin disease that would go away with time. This was a grave strategic error that would haunt him for the rest of his career. The Japanese, seeing the nationalist government's weakness and preoccupation, began to push further into northern China. Their aggression was a constant reminder to the Chinese people that their country was still at the mercy of foreign powers. This was a national humiliation, a wound that the Chinese people could no longer ignore. The Chinese Communist Party, which had now established a new base in the remote northwestern city of Yan'an, was a small, ragtag force, but they were the only ones who were actively fighting the Japanese. They used guerrilla tactics to harass the Japanese forces and to win the hearts and minds of the local population. They were a bit like the scrappy underdog in a fight, and people were starting to cheer for them. In 1936, a dramatic and pivotal event took place that would change the course of the Civil War. It was known as the Xi'an Incident. Two of Chiang Kai-shek's generals, Zheng Shuiliang and Yang Hucheng, who were deeply frustrated with his focus on the Civil War instead of the Japanese threat, kidnapped him in the city of Xi'an. The generals demanded that Chiang Kai-shek stop fighting the communists and instead form a new alliance to resist the Japanese invaders. It was a high-stakes moment, a national crisis that had the potential to plunge the country into even more chaos. The kidnapping of Chiang Kai-shek was a huge shock to everyone. The nationalist government was in disarray, and the communists, who had just narrowly escaped complete annihilation on the Long March, were in a very good position. The Communist Party's leadership, including Mao Zedong, was faced with a difficult decision. Should they kill Chiang Kai-shek and get rid of their greatest enemy once and for all? Or should they use this opportunity to force him to unite with them against the Japanese? The Soviet Union, which was now deeply concerned about the growing power of Japan, urged the Chinese communists to make peace with Chiang Kai-shek. They believed that a united China was the only way to stop the Japanese from expanding their power. In the end, a deal was brokered. Chiang Kai-shek was released, and in return, he agreed to form a new alliance with the Communists. This was the Second United Front. It was not a partnership of trust, but a partnership of necessity. Chiang Kai-shek still hated the Communists, but he was now forced to see the Japanese as the greater threat. The Communists, for their part, agreed to suspend the Civil War, to put their forces under the command of the nationalist government, and to abandon their revolutionary base in Yan'an. It was a deal that was a win-win for both sides. The nationalists got a powerful new ally to fight the Japanese, and the communists got a reprieve from the Civil War, a chance to rebuild their army and to expand their influence in the North. Historians still argue about the true motivations of the various parties during the Xi'an incident. Was it a genuine moment of patriotism, or was it just a political ploy? Regardless of the motivations, the result was a new alliance that would fundamentally change the course of the Chinese Revolution. The two enemies, who had been fighting for years, were now forced to work together against a common foe. The Civil War was put on hold, but the ideological struggle was not. The stage was set for the next, most violent chapter of the Chinese Revolution, a chapter that would be dominated not by internal conflict, but by a full-scale foreign invasion. With the Second United Front in place, the Chinese Civil War was temporarily on hold. The Nationalists and the Communists, two bitter enemies, were now forced to stand together against a common and much greater foe. The fragile peace was tested almost immediately. On July 7, 1937, a minor skirmish between Japanese and Chinese troops at the Marco Polo Bridge near Beijing escalated into a full-blown conflict. The Japanese, who had been looking for a pretext to launch a full-scale invasion of China, seized the opportunity. The skirmish was the spark that ignited the Sino-Japanese War, a brutal and bloody conflict that would last for 8 years and profoundly change the course of Chinese history. The Japanese invasion was swift and devastating. The Japanese military, with its modern air force, tanks, and well-trained infantry, was far superior to the Chinese forces. They quickly captured Beijing and then launched a full-scale assault on Shanghai, the most important commercial and industrial city in China. The Battle of Shanghai was a long and bloody affair, a brutal urban war that lasted for 3 months. Chiang Kai-shek's best troops fought bravely, but they were no match for the Japanese war machine. The city fell, and the Japanese army, now drunk with victory, marched on the nationalist capital of Nanjing. The fall of Nanjing was a humanitarian disaster. The Japanese military, fueled by a sense of racial superiority and a desire for revenge, launched a 6-week orgy of violence. The Nanjing Massacre, as it came to be known, was a period of extreme brutality, with the Japanese army killing hundreds of thousands of Chinese civilians and soldiers and committing widespread rape and looting. It was an event that shocked the world and forever seared the Japanese military's brutality into the memory of the Chinese people. The nationalist government, now in complete disarray, was forced to flee. As the Japanese invasion continued, the nationalist government was forced to abandon its major cities and retreat to the interior of China. Chiang Kai-shek's government relocated to the remote city of Chongqing, a mountainous and hard-to-reach city that became the provisional capital of the nationalist government. The move was a symbol of the government's weakness and its desperate struggle for survival. They were a government on the run, a far cry from the victorious army that had marched into Shanghai just a few years earlier. The Japanese, who now controlled most of China's major cities and coastal areas, were confident that their victory was a matter of time. The Sino-Japanese War was not just a military conflict, it was a psychological one. The Chinese people had to endure years of war, poverty, and humiliation. The Japanese military used a scorched earth policy, destroying villages and killing civilians in an effort to break the Chinese people's will to resist. The war was a brutal and costly affair for both sides, but it was especially so for China, which lost millions of lives and saw its infrastructure and economy completely destroyed. The war also had a profound impact on the political landscape of China. The nationalist government, which was now in exile in Chongqing, was seen as weak and ineffective. They were not able to mount a successful counterattack against the Japanese, and they were often accused of being corrupt and out of touch with the suffering of the Chinese people. The communists, on the other hand, who were fighting a guerrilla war in the countryside, were seen as the true patriots of China. The Sino-Japanese War was the backdrop for a much larger global conflict, World War II. It was a war that would see China's struggle become a part of a much larger fight against fascism and imperialism. The war also forced the two enemies, the nationalists and the communists, to work together, however uneasily, against a common foe. But beneath the surface of the alliance, the seeds of the next and final phase of the Chinese Civil War were being sown. The war had weakened the nationalist government and allowed the communists to expand their influence and their military strength. As the Japanese advanced, the nationalist government of Chiang Kai-shek was forced to retreat deeper and deeper into China's interior. In the face of overwhelming military force, Chiang made the difficult decision to abandon the coast and its major cities, which were the economic and industrial heart of the nation. He moved his government to Chongqing, a sprawling city nestled in the mountainous Sichuan province. The city was a natural fortress, surrounded by rivers and steep hills, making it difficult for the Japanese to attack. But it was also a symbol of the nationalist government's desperate situation. They were a government in exile, cut off from their own people and their most important resources. The retreat to Chongqing was a strategic necessity, but it was also a public relations nightmare. It made the nationalist government look weak and ineffective, a government that was more interested in its own survival than in fighting the Japanese. Life in Chongqing was difficult. The city was constantly under attack by Japanese bombers, and the people had to endure years of bombings, poverty, and food shortages. The government was also riddled with corruption and inefficiency. The high-ranking officials and their families lived a life of luxury, while the common people suffered. This created a deep-seated resentment among the Chinese population, who saw the government as out of touch and uncaring. This was a critical failure on Chiang's part, a kind of self-inflicted wound. He was so focused on fighting the Japanese and containing the communists that he failed to address the needs of his own people. While the nationalist government was struggling in Chongqing, the Chinese Communist Party was in a very different position. They had established a new base in the remote northwestern city of Yan'an, a place that was difficult for the Japanese to reach and even more difficult for the nationalists to attack. The communists were a small but highly motivated force. They had a new strategy, a new leader, and a new sense of purpose. They were not fighting a conventional war. They were fighting a guerrilla war, a war of attrition, a war of the people. They used the vast, rugged landscape of northern China to their advantage. They ambushed Japanese supply convoys, they harassed their forces, and they won the support of the local population by treating them with respect and helping them with their daily lives. The communist strategy was a simple but brilliant one. They knew that they could not defeat the Japanese army in a head-to-head battle, so they focused on wearing them down. They established a network of rural base areas, which they used to launch attacks and to recruit new soldiers. They also used propaganda to win the support of the people, promising to end the Japanese occupation and to create a new, more equal society. The communists were not just fighting a military war, they were fighting a political one. They were winning the hearts and minds of the Chinese people, who saw them as the true patriots of China. This was a huge contrast to the nationalist government in Chongqing, which was seen as a government of privilege and corruption. The Sino-Japanese War was a brutal and costly affair for both the nationalists and the communists, but it had a very different impact on the two parties. For the nationalists, the war was a period of decline and decay. They lost their most important cities, their economy was in ruins, and their reputation was in tatters. For the communists, the war was a period of growth and expansion. They were able to build a large and disciplined army, to expand their territory, and to win the support of the Chinese people. The war had not only weakened the nationalist government, it had also allowed the communists to emerge as a powerful and legitimate alternative. The stage was being set for the next and final phase of the Chinese Civil War. The two enemies, who had been fighting for years, were now on a collision course, and this time there would be no more truces or alliances. While the nationalists were struggling in Chongqing, the communists in Yan'an were using their time wisely. They were not just fighting a guerrilla war, they were building a new political and social order in their rural base areas. The Japanese invasion had given them an opportunity to expand their influence and to win the support of the Chinese people, an opportunity that they seized with both hands. The communist military strategy was simple and effective. They would fight the Japanese with guerrilla tactics, and they would use the war to win the hearts and minds of the people. This was a war not just of armies, but of ideas. The communists' approach to the war was a stark contrast to the nationalists. While Chiang Kai-shek's army was focused on fighting large-scale conventional battles, the communists were focused on building a grassroots resistance movement. They organized local militias, they conducted land reform in the areas they controlled, and they helped the local population with everything from farming to education. They presented themselves as the true defenders of the nation, the ones who were willing to fight the Japanese on the front lines and to share in the suffering of the Chinese people. This was a powerful message, and it resonated with the vast majority of the Chinese population who were tired of the corruption and incompetence of the nationalist government. The communists were not just a military force, they were a political one, a party that was deeply embedded in the lives of the people. The communists also used the war to consolidate their political power. Mao Zedong, who was now the undisputed leader of the party, launched a series of political campaigns, including the Yan'an Rectification movement, to weed out any dissent and to ensure that the party was a unified and disciplined force. This was a brutal but effective campaign that cemented Mao's authority and ensured that the party was loyal to his ideas. He was a master of political maneuvering, a man who knew how to use a crisis to his advantage. The party's ideology, which had once been a rigid, Soviet-style orthodoxy, was now being adapted to fit the unique conditions of China. This was a process of Sinicization, a process that would forever change the nature of Chinese communism. The Sino-Japanese War was also a global war, and both the nationalists and the communists were forced to deal with foreign powers. The nationalist government in Chongqing was a key ally of the United States and Great Britain. They received a huge amount of military and financial aid, but this aid was often bogged down by corruption and inefficiency. The Americans, who were fighting a war on a global scale, were often frustrated with the nationalist government's ineffectiveness. They wanted Chiang Kai-shek to fight a more aggressive war against the Japanese, but he was more focused on hoarding his resources for the inevitable civil war with the communists. This created a deep-seated distrust between the United States and the nationalist government, a distrust that would have long-term consequences. The communists, on the other hand, received a small amount of aid from the Soviet Union, but they were largely on their own. They had to rely on their own resources and their own ingenuity to survive. This forced them to be more disciplined, more resourceful, and more deeply connected to the Chinese people. They were a bit like a self-sufficient commune that was also fighting a war. They were building a new society from the ground up, and they were using the war to do it. The war was not just a military conflict. It was also a social and political revolution. The nationalists, who were so focused on fighting the Japanese and containing the communists, failed to see that the war was changing the very fabric of Chinese society. They were fighting a war of the past, while the communists were fighting a war of the future. The stage was being set for the final and most decisive phase of the Chinese Civil War. As the Sino-Japanese War continued, the two rival Chinese factions were not just fighting Japan, they were also vying for the support of the great powers. The nationalist government in Chongqing was officially the main recipient of Western aid, particularly from the United States. America saw Chiang Kai-shek's government as the legitimate representative of China and a key ally in the war against Japan. They provided immense financial and military support, including sending a military mission and a team of advisors to help train the nationalist army. It was a huge influx of resources, but much of it was lost to corruption and inefficiency. The American advisors were often frustrated with the nationalist government's reluctance to fight a more aggressive war against the Japanese. Chiang Kai-shek was a bit like a student who was given a massive allowance, but was more interested in saving it for a rainy day than in spending it on his homework. He was more focused on hoarding his resources for the inevitable civil war with the communists, a strategy that deeply frustrated his American allies. The American and British military and diplomatic missions in China were a mix of hope and frustration. They saw China as a potential great power, a key player in the war against Japan, and a future ally against the Soviet Union. But they were also deeply concerned about the nationalist government's corruption, its lack of popular support, and its authoritarian tendencies. They often tried to mediate between the nationalists and the communists, hoping to create a unified front that could fight as a more effective war against Japan. These efforts, however, were largely unsuccessful. Chiang Kai-shek was deeply suspicious of the communists, and he saw any attempt to help them as a betrayal. He was a man who believed that his enemies were more dangerous than his allies, and he was not willing to compromise on that. The Soviet Union, on the other hand, was the primary foreign supporter of the Chinese Communist Party. They provided the communists with a small amount of military and financial aid, but their support was more ideological than material. They were also deeply concerned about the growing power of Japan, and they saw a strong, unified China as a key ally in the global struggle against imperialism and fascism. They had a complex relationship with both the nationalists and the communists, and they often played both sides against each other. The Sino-Japanese War also had a profound impact on the United States' understanding of China. The American public was largely sympathetic to the Chinese cause, and they saw Chiang Kai-shek and his wife, Sun Meiling, as heroic figures. Sun Meiling, a graduate of Wellesley College, was a brilliant and eloquent speaker who traveled to the United States to rally support for her country. She was a master of public relations, a person who could charm the American people and the American government. But behind the scenes, there were deep divisions and frustrations. American officials in China, many of whom were more sympathetic to the communists, saw a very different reality. They saw the corruption of the nationalist government, and they were often amazed by the discipline and popular support of the communists. Historians still argue about the extent to which foreign involvement in the Sino-Japanese War and the Chinese Civil War was a help or a hindrance. Some argue that the United States' support for the nationalist government was a major mistake that prolonged the Civil War and led to the communist victory. Others argue that the United States was simply trying to do the right thing and that the nationalist government was too corrupt to be saved. The war was not just a conflict between two Chinese factions. It was a conflict between two competing visions for China's future, a conflict that was deeply intertwined with the global struggle between democracy and communism. The stage was being set for the next and final phase of the Chinese Civil War. The two enemies, who had been fighting for years, were now on a collision course, and this time there would be no more truces or alliances. With the defeat of Japan in 1945, the uneasy alliance between the nationalists and the communists came to a swift and predictable end. The Second United Front, a partnership born of necessity, was no longer needed. The two sides, who had spent the last 8 years fighting a common enemy, were now back on a collision course. The Civil War, which had been on hold, was about to resume, and this time it would be a fight to the finish. The nationalist government, led by Chiang Kai-shek, was confident of victory. They had the support of the United States, a much larger army, and a huge amount of modern military equipment that had been supplied by the Americans. They were a bit like a heavyweight boxer who had just been given a brand new pair of gloves and was ready for the main event. The American government, still hoping to avoid a full-scale civil war, tried to mediate a peace between the two sides. They sent a special envoy, General George C. Marshall, to China to negotiate a truce and to create a new, unified, and democratic government. The negotiations, however, were a complete failure. Both sides were too deeply entrenched in their own ideologies and too suspicious of each other to compromise. Chiang Kai-shek was determined to crush the communists once and for all, and Mao Zedong was determined to win the revolution. The Civil War was no longer a question of if, but a question of when. The fighting resumed almost immediately. The first phase of the war, from 1945 to 1947, was a series of small-scale skirmishes and battles. The Nationalist Army, with its superior numbers and equipment, initially had the upper hand. They were able to capture most of the major cities and transportation hubs. But the Communists, who had a much different strategy, were not focused on capturing cities. They were focused on controlling the countryside, the vast rural landscape that made up the majority of China. They used the guerrilla tactics that they had perfected during the Sino-Japanese War, ambushing nationalist convoys, destroying their supply lines, and winning the support of the local population. It was a classic war of the people, a war that was fought not just with bullets, but with ideas and with a deep understanding of the Chinese people. The Communists had a powerful advantage that the Nationalists did not: the support of the Chinese peasantry. During the Sino-Japanese War, the Communists had implemented a radical program of land reform in the areas they controlled. They had seized land from wealthy landlords and distributed it to the poor peasants. This was a revolutionary act, and it won them immense popular support. For the first time, many peasants had their own land to farm, and they were willing to do whatever it took to defend it. They were not just passive supporters, they were active participants in the revolution. The Nationalists, on the other hand, were seen as a government of landlords and corrupt officials. They were a government that had lost the trust and the support of the people. The Civil War was a classic battle between a conventional army and a guerrilla force. The Nationalist Army was strong in the cities, but weak in the countryside. They were like a fish that was out of water. The Communist Army, on the other hand, was a fish that was in its own element. They were deeply embedded in the lives of the people, and they used this to their advantage. They were able to use their vast network of spies and informants to gather intelligence and to plan their attacks. The Nationalists, who were so focused on fighting a conventional war, failed to see that the war was a political one. They were fighting a war of the past, while the Communists were fighting a war of the future. The stage was being set for the next and most decisive phase of the Chinese Civil War. The two enemies, who had been fighting for years, were now on a collision course, and this time There would be no more truces or alliances. After the initial skirmishes, the Chinese Civil War entered a new and much more decisive phase. The nationalists and the communists were now locked in a struggle for control of the country's most important regions, and the fate of the nation would be decided on the battlefield. One of the most critical fronts was Manchuria, a vast and resource-rich region in northeastern China that had been occupied by the Japanese during the war. After Japan's defeat, the Soviet Union had moved into the region, and they were a bit like a big brother who had come to a family squabble and was now quietly helping out one side. The Soviets, who were in control of the territory, turned over a huge amount of captured Japanese military equipment and weapons to the Chinese communists. This was a monumental advantage for the communists, who had been fighting a war with a mix of old rifles and captured equipment. They were now a well-armed and well-trained military force. The nationalists, on the other hand, had their own advantages. They had a much larger army, and they had been airlifted into Manchuria by the United States to secure the territory and to prevent the Soviets and communists from taking full control. But the nationalist army was not in a good position. They were far from their home base, their supply lines were stretched thin, and their morale was low. They were like an army that had just been dropped into the middle of a war zone, with no map and no clear mission. The communists, on the other hand, were in their own element. They had the support of the local population, and they were using the guerrilla tactics that they had perfected during the war. They were able to use their vast network of spies and informants to gather intelligence and to plan their attacks. The battle for Manchuria was a long and brutal affair. The nationalists and the communists were locked in a war of attrition, a war that would last for more than a year. The communists, under the brilliant command of their top general, Lin Biao, used a strategy of mobile warfare and encirclement. They would surround the nationalist forces, cut off their supply lines, and then slowly but surely defeat them. The nationalists, who were so focused on fighting a conventional war, failed to see that they were being outmaneuvered. They were losing not just battles, but also the supports of the local population, who saw the communists as their saviors and the nationalists as their oppressors. The battle for Manchuria was a major turning point in the Chinese Civil War. It was here that the communists proved that they were not just a guerrilla force, but a professional army that was capable of defeating the nationalists in a conventional war. The nationalist government, which had been so confident of victory, was now on the defensive. They had lost their most important strategic territory, and they had lost the support of the Chinese people. The loss of Manchuria was a catastrophic blow to the nationalist government and a huge victory for the Chinese Communist Party. It was a sign that the tide of the war was turning, and it was a sign that the communists were now a real and present danger. Historians still argue about the true significance of the Soviet support for the Chinese communists. Some argue that it was a decisive factor that led to the communist victory, while others argue that the communists would have won the war regardless. Regardless of the motivations, the result was a new, more powerful, and more confident Chinese Communist Party. The war was no longer a question of if the communists would win, but a question of when. The stage was being set for the next and most decisive phase of the Chinese Civil War. The two enemies, who had been fighting for years, were now on a collision course, and this time there would be no more truces or alliances. With the loss of Manchuria, the nationalist government was now on the defensive. The communist forces, now a well-trained and well-armed army, were on the march, and the nationalist army, which was bogged down by corruption and a lack of popular support, was in a very bad position. Chiang Kai-shek, who had been so confident of victory, was now faced with a complete and utter military disaster. The Civil War was no longer a series of small skirmishes. It was a full-scale war, a war that would be decided in a series of large-scale, decisive battles. The communists, who had once been a small, scattered force, were now a powerful, unified, and highly motivated army. The Nationalist Army, despite its superior numbers and American equipment, was no match for the Communists' superior strategy and popular support. The Communists were using a strategy of encircle the cities from the countryside, a strategy that was perfectly suited to the conditions of the war. They would surround the nationalist-held cities, cut off their supply lines, and then wait for the cities to fall. It was a strategy that was both brilliant and brutal, and it was a strategy that the nationalists had no answer for. The nationalist army was like a fish that was out of water. They were a professional army that was trained to fight a conventional war, but the communists were fighting a war of a different kind. They were a guerrilla force that was deeply embedded in the lives of the people, and they used this to their advantage. The communists also had a powerful new weapon that the nationalists did not: the support of the Chinese peasantry. The communists had implemented a radical program of land reform in the areas they controlled, a program that had won them immense popular support. The peasants, who had been brutalized by years of war and poverty, saw the communists as their saviors and the nationalists as their oppressors. They were willing to do whatever it took to help the communists, from providing them with food and supplies to acting as spies and informants. The nationalists, on the other hand, were seen as a government of landlords and corrupt officials. They were a government that had lost the trust and the support of the people. The nationalist army, which was now in disarray, was also suffering from a severe lack of morale. The soldiers were tired of fighting a war that they did not believe in, and they were tired of fighting for a government that they saw as corrupt and ineffective. They were also suffering from a severe lack of supplies. The communists, who were now in control of most of the countryside, were able to cut off the nationalist supply lines, and the nationalist army was forced to fight a war without food, without ammunition, and without hope. The communists, on the other hand, were fighting a war that they believed in, a war for a new, more equal society. They were a highly motivated and highly disciplined army, and they were winning. The Chinese Civil War was a classic battle between a conventional army and a guerrilla force. The nationalist army was strong in the cities, but weak in the countryside. They were like a fish that was out of water. The communist army, on the other hand, was a fish that was in its own element. They were deeply embedded in the lives of the people, and they used this to their advantage. They were able to use their vast network of spies and informants to gather intelligence and to plan their attacks. The nationalists, who were so focused on fighting a conventional war, failed to see that the war was a political one. They were fighting a war of the past, while the communists were fighting a war of the future. The stage was being set for the next and most decisive phase of the Chinese Civil War. The two enemies, who had been fighting for years, were now on a collision course, and this time there would be no more truces or alliances. The tide of the Chinese Civil War had turned decisively. The Communist Army, which had now been renamed the People's Liberation Army, was on the offensive, and the nationalist government was on the verge of collapse. The war was no longer a question of who would win, but a question of when. The final and most decisive phase of the war would be fought in a series of massive campaigns, each one a testament to the communists' superior strategy and the nationalists' complete incompetence. The most important of these was the Huaihai campaign, a colossal battle that would decide the fate of China. It was a bit like the final boss battle in a video game, only the stakes were much, much higher. The Huaihai campaign began in November 1948 in the eastern provinces of Jiangsu, Shandong, Anhui, and Henan. The communists, under the command of their most brilliant generals, including Liu Bocheng, Chen Yi, and Deng Xiaoping, had a simple but brilliant strategy. They would use a combination of encirclement and mobile warfare to defeat the nationalist army. The nationalists, who had a huge army of nearly 800,000 men, were confident of victory. But they were no match for the communists' superior strategy and their deep understanding of the battlefield. The communists were like a team of chess grandmasters playing against a group of novices. The nationalists had more pieces, but the communists were playing a much smarter game. The battle was a brutal and bloody affair that lasted for more than 2 months. The communists, who had the support of the local population, were able to use their vast network of spies and informants to gather intelligence and to plan their attacks. The nationalists, on the other hand, were completely in the dark. They were fighting a war in a country that they no longer understood, and for a people who no longer supported them. The communists were able to use their superior knowledge of the terrain to their advantage. They ambushed nationalist convoys, they cut off their supply lines, and they slowly but surely encircled the nationalist forces. The nationalists, who were so focused on fighting a conventional war, failed to see that they were being outmaneuvered. The Huaihai campaign was a catastrophic defeat for the nationalist government. The nationalist army was completely destroyed, and the nationalist government lost its most important military and political leaders. The defeat was a huge blow to the nationalist government's morale and its reputation. The nationalist army, which had been seen as the savior of the nation, was now seen as a complete and utter failure. The defeat also had a profound impact on the nationalist government's relationship with the United States. The Americans, who had been a key backer of the nationalist government, were now beginning to lose faith in their ability to win the war. The Huaihai campaign was not just a military victory, it was a political one. The communists, who had won the support of the Chinese people, were now seen as the legitimate rulers of the nation. The nationalist government, which was so focused on fighting the communists, had failed to see that the war was a political one. They were fighting a war of the past, while the communists were fighting a war of the future. The victory at Huaihai was a sign that the communists were now a powerful and legitimate force, and it was a sign that the nationalist government was on the verge of collapse. The stage was being set for the next and most decisive phase of the Chinese Civil War. The two enemies, who had been fighting for years, were now on a collision course, and this time there would be no more truces or alliances. After the catastrophic defeat in the Huaihai campaign, the nationalist government was on its last legs. The nationalist army, which had been the backbone of Chiang Kai-shek's power, was now a demoralized and scattered force. The communists, on the other hand, were on the march, and their victory was now a foregone conclusion. The war was no longer being fought in the countryside, but in the cities, and the nationalists, who had been so confident in their ability to hold the cities, were now faced with a new reality. The communists, with their superior numbers and their deep popular support, were able to use a combination of encirclement and psychological warfare to force the nationalist cities to surrender. The fall of Nanjing, the nationalist capital, was a symbolic and strategic victory for the communists. In April 1949, the People's Liberation Army crossed the Yangtze River and marched on Nanjing. The nationalist government, which had been so confident in its ability to hold the city, was now in complete disarray. Chiang Kai-shek, who had been the undisputed leader of the nation for more than 2 decades, was forced to flee. He had seen the writing on the wall, and he knew that his time was up. The nationalist army, which was now in disarray, was no match for the communists' superior numbers and their deep popular support. The city fell with barely a fight, and the communists, who had been a hunted and scattered force just a few years earlier, were now the masters of the nationalist capital. The fall of Nanjing was a huge blow to the nationalist government's morale and its reputation. It was a sign that the nationalist government was no longer a legitimate force and that the communists were now the legitimate rulers of the nation. The defeat also had a profound impact on the nationalist government's relationship with the United States. The Americans, who had been a key backer of the nationalist government, were now beginning to lose faith in their ability to win the war. The nationalist government, which was so focused on fighting the communists, had failed to see that the war was a political one. They were fighting a war of the past, while the communists were fighting a war of the future. The defeat at Nanjing was a sign that the nationalist government was on the verge of collapse. The fall of Nanjing was also a personal humiliation for Chiang Kai-shek. He had dedicated his life to fighting the communists, and he had seen them as a dangerous and illegitimate force. Now they were the masters of his capital, and he was a man on the run. He had lost the war, and he had lost the trust and the support of the Chinese people. He was no longer the leader of the nation, but a man who was trying to hold on to a lost cause. He and his most loyal followers fled to the island of Taiwan, a place where they hoped to rebuild their government and to one day return to the mainland. Historians still argue about the true significance of the fall of Nanjing. Some see it as the final, decisive battle of the Chinese Civil War, while others see it as a symbolic victory that simply confirmed a foregone conclusion. Regardless of the motivations, the result was a new and much more powerful Chinese Communist Party. The war was no longer a question of if the communists would win, but a question of when. The stage was being set for the next and most decisive phase of the Chinese Civil War. The two enemies who had been fighting for years were now on a collision course, and this time there would be no more truces or alliances. With the nationalist capital of Nanjing fallen, the end of the Chinese Civil War was now a matter of when, not if. The nationalist government was now a government in exile, a scattered and demoralized force that was on the run. The communists, on the other hand, were on the march, and they were a unified, disciplined, and highly motivated army. They had won the war, not just on the battlefield, but in the hearts and minds of the Chinese people. The nationalist army, which was bogged down by corruption and a lack of popular support, was in a very bad position. They were losing not just battles, but also the will to fight. The nationalist government, now led by Chiang Kai-shek's son, was a government in disarray. They had lost their most important strategic territory, and they had lost the trust of the Chinese people. They were a government of landlords and corrupt officials, and they had failed to address the needs of the vast majority of the Chinese population who were tired of war, poverty, and humiliation. They were a government that had lost its legitimacy, and they were now a government that was a lost cause. The communists, on the other hand, were seen as the legitimate rulers of the nation. They had won the support of the Chinese people, and they were now a powerful and legitimate force. The final phase of the Civil War was a series of mopping up operations. The communists, with their superior numbers and their deep popular support, were able to use a combination of encirclement and psychological warfare to force the nationalist cities to surrender. The nationalist army, which was now in disarray, was no match for the communists' superior numbers and their deep popular support. The city after city fell, and the nationalist government was now on the verge of complete collapse. They had no place to go and no one to turn to. The nationalist government, which had been so confident in its ability to win the war, was now faced with a new reality. They had lost the war, and they had lost the trust and the support of the Chinese people. The war was no longer being fought on the battlefield, but in the cities, and the nationalists, who had been so confident in their ability to hold the cities, were now faced with a new reality. The communists, with their superior numbers and their deep popular support, were able to use a combination of encirclement and psychological warfare to force the nationalist cities to surrender. The nationalist army, which was now in disarray, was no match for the communists' superior numbers and their deep popular support. The city after city fell, and the nationalist government was now on the verge of complete collapse. They had no place to go and no one to turn to. The nationalist government, which had been so confident in its ability to win the war, was now faced with a new reality. They had lost the war, and they had lost the trust and the support of the Chinese people. The war was no longer being fought on the battlefield, but in the cities, and the nationalists, who had been so confident in their ability to hold the cities, were now faced with a new reality. The communists, with their superior numbers and their deep popular support, were able to use a combination of encirclement and psychological warfare to force the nationalist cities to surrender. The nationalist army, which was now in disarray, was no match for the communists' superior numbers and their deep popular support. The city after city fell, and the nationalist government was now on the verge of complete collapse. They had no place to go and no one to turn to. The nationalist government, which had been so confident in its ability to win the war, was now faced with a new reality. They had lost the war, and they had lost the trust and the support of the Chinese people. With the nationalist government on the verge of collapse, the final act of the Chinese Revolution was about to begin. The communist forces, now in control of most of northern and central China, were on the verge of total victory. They had won the war not just on the battlefield, but also in the hearts and minds of the Chinese people, who saw them as the legitimate rulers of the nation. The nationalist government, which was a government in disarray, had lost the trust and the support of the people. They were a government of landlords and corrupt officials, and they had failed to address the needs of the vast majority of the Chinese population, who were tired of war, poverty, and humiliation. The communist victory was a long and bloody one, but it was also a testament to their superior strategy and their deep popular support. The nationalist government, which was so focused on fighting the communists, had failed to see that the war was a political one. They were fighting a war of the past, while the communists were fighting a war of the future. The communists were a powerful, unified, and highly motivated army, and they were now the masters of the nation. The nationalist government, which was so confident in its ability to win the war, was now faced with a new reality. They had lost the war, and they had lost the trust and the support of the Chinese people. The final act of the Chinese Revolution came on October 1st, 1949. On that day, from atop the Tiananmen Gate in Beijing, Mao Zedong, the leader of the Chinese Communist Party, formally proclaimed the establishment of the People's Republic of China. The announcement was a huge moment in Chinese history, a moment that marked the end of the Chinese Civil War and the beginning of a new era. The crowd, which had gathered in the square, erupted in a roar of cheers, a roar that was a mix of joy, relief, and hope. The people had been through years of war, poverty, and humiliation, and now, for the first time in a long time, they had a reason to hope for a better future. The establishment of the People's Republic of China was a major blow to the United States and its allies. The Americans, who had been a key backer of the nationalist government, were now faced with a new reality. They had lost China, and they had lost it to the communists. The loss of China was a huge shock to the American public and to the American government. It was a moment that would forever change the course of American foreign policy. The Americans, who had been so confident in their ability to win the Cold War, were now faced with a new reality. The communists were a powerful and legitimate force, and they were now in control of the world's most populous nation. The establishment of the People's Republic of China was a huge moment in Chinese history. It marked the end of a long and bloody civil war and the beginning of a new era. The Chinese people, who had been through years of war, poverty, and humiliation, were now faced with a new reality. The communists were in power, and they were determined to build a new, more equal society. The war was over, but the revolution was not. The communists, who had won the war, were now faced with a new challenge: how to build a new nation from the ground up. The stage was being set for the next and most decisive phase of the Chinese Revolution. While the Chinese mainland celebrated the birth of the People's Republic, the defeated nationalist government and its army were in a state of chaotic retreat. Chiang Kai-shek, his family, and his most loyal followers, along with an estimated 2 million soldiers and civilians, fled to the island of Taiwan. It was a mass exodus, a final desperate flight from a lost cause. They took with them not just their families and their soldiers, but also the nation's gold reserves, a huge amount of cultural artifacts from the Forbidden City, and the very symbols of the nationalist government. They were a government in exile, a lost army that was trying to rebuild its government and its reputation on a small, remote island. The flight to Taiwan was a final, tragic act in a long and bloody civil war. It was a sign that the nationalist government, which had been the legitimate ruler of China for more than 2 decades, was now a government of a single island, a government that was trying to hold on to a lost cause. The establishment of the nationalist government in Taiwan, a government that was a bit like a ghost of the past, created a new and complex political reality. There were now 2 Chinas, a People's Republic of China on the mainland and a Republic of China on the island of Taiwan. The 2 governments claimed to be the legitimate rulers of all of China, and they were locked in a diplomatic and military standoff that would last for decades. The United States, which had been a key backer of the nationalist government, was now faced with a difficult choice. Should they recognize the new communist government on the mainland, or should they continue to support the nationalist government on the island of Taiwan? The Americans, who were so focused on fighting the Cold War, chose to support the nationalist government, a decision that would have long-term consequences. Meanwhile, on the mainland, the new communist government was faced with a new and much larger challenge: how to build a new nation from the ground up. The country was in a state of complete and utter devastation. The economy was in ruins, the infrastructure was destroyed, and the people were exhausted from decades of war. The communists, who had won the war, were now faced with a new reality. They had to rebuild the nation, and they had to do it from scratch. They launched a series of campaigns, including the land reform movement, to seize land from wealthy landlords and to distribute it to the poor peasants. This was a revolutionary act, and it won them immense popular support. They also launched a series of social campaigns to end prostitution, drug addiction, and corruption, which had been a huge problem under the nationalist government. The early years of the People's Republic of China were a period of immense change and immense struggle. The communists, who had won the war, were now faced with a new reality. They had to rebuild the nation, and they had to do it from scratch. They launched a series of campaigns to seize land from wealthy landlords and to distribute it to the poor peasants. This was a revolutionary act, and it won them immense popular support. They also launched a series of social campaigns to end prostitution, drug addiction, and corruption, which had been a huge problem under the nationalist government. The communists were not just a military force, they were a political and social one, a party that was deeply embedded in the lives of the people. They were building a new society from the ground up, and they were using the power of the state to do it. The war was over, but the revolution was not. With the Chinese Civil War over and the nationalist government in exile on Taiwan, the newly established People's Republic of China faced a monumental task. The country was in ruins, its economy was in tatters, and its population was exhausted from decades of war and chaos. The communists, who had won the military and political struggle, were now faced with the challenge of governing a nation of more than 500 million people. They were a party of revolutionaries, and now they had to learn how to be a party of administrators. This was not an easy transition. The early years of the People's Republic were a period of immense social and political change. The new government, under the leadership of Mao Zedong, launched a series of campaigns to consolidate its power and to transform Chinese society. The most important of these was the land reform movement. This was a brutal but highly effective campaign to seize land from wealthy landlords and to redistribute it to the poor peasants. The campaign was not a peaceful one. It was a violent revolution in the countryside, a revolution that would end the traditional power of the landlords once and for all. The communists saw this as a necessary step to build a new, more equal society, and they were willing to use violence to achieve their goals. The land reform movement won the communists immense popular support from the vast majority of the Chinese population, who had been brutalized by years of war and poverty. The new government also launched a series of social campaigns to end prostitution, drug addiction, and corruption, which had been a huge problem under the nationalist government. These campaigns were a huge success, and they won the communists a great deal of respect from the Chinese people. The communists were not just a military force, they were a political and social one, a party that was deeply embedded in the lives of the people. They were building a new society from the ground up, and they were using the power of the state to do it. The war was over, but the revolution was not. The communists, who had won the war, were now faced with a new challenge: how to build a new nation from the ground up. The new government also had to deal with the problem of foreign relations. The United States and its allies refused to recognize the new communist government and instead continued to support the nationalist government on Taiwan. This created a diplomatic and military standoff that would last for decades. The Americans, who were so focused on fighting the Cold War, saw the new communist government as a dangerous enemy that had just taken control of the world's most populous nation. The new government, on the other hand, saw the United States as an imperialist power that was trying to undermine its revolution. This created a long and bloody conflict, a conflict that would be fought not just with armies, but with ideas. The early years of the People's Republic of China were a period of immense change and immense struggle. The communists, who had won the war, were now faced with a new reality. They had to rebuild the nation, and they had to do it from scratch. They launched a series of campaigns to seize land from wealthy landlords and to distribute it to the poor peasants. This was a revolutionary act, and it won them immense popular support. They also launched a series of social campaigns to end prostitution, drug addiction, and corruption, which had been a huge problem under the nationalist government. The communists were not just a military force, they were a political and social one, a party that was deeply embedded in the lives of the people. They were building a new society from the ground up, and they were using the power of the state to do it. The war was over, but the revolution was not. The story of the Chinese Revolution, a journey of more than a century, did not end on the day the People's Republic was founded. The victory of the communists was not the final chapter, but a profound and lasting beginning. The legacy of the revolution is a complex and contradictory one, a story of immense triumphs and immense tragedies. The revolution ended a long and chaotic period of civil war and foreign imperialism, and it created a new, unified, and independent nation. For the first time in a long time, the Chinese people had a government that was a legitimate ruler, and they had a reason to hope for a better future. But the revolution also had a darker side. The communists, who had won the war, were also a party that was willing to use violence and repression to achieve its goals. They were a party that was deeply suspicious of dissent, and they were a party that was determined to build a new, socialist society, no matter the cost. The legacy of the Chinese Revolution is still being debated today. Some see it as a story of national liberation, a story of a nation that finally stood up to foreign imperialism and took control of its own destiny. They point to the immense economic growth and social progress that China has made in the decades since the revolution, a story of a nation that has gone from a poor, backward country to a global superpower. They see the revolution as a necessary and inevitable step, a step that was needed to free the Chinese people from the shackles of the past. Others see the revolution as a story of immense human cost and political repression. They point to the millions of people who died during the land reform movement, the Great Leap Forward, and the Cultural Revolution, a story of a nation that was willing to sacrifice its own people for the sake of an ideology. They see the revolution as a betrayal of its original ideals, a story of a revolution that was supposed to bring freedom and democracy, but instead brought a new form of authoritarianism. Historians still argue whether the Chinese Revolution was a story of a nation that was freed from the past or a story of a nation that was imprisoned by the future. The story of the Chinese Revolution is a story of a nation that was trying to find its way out of the past and into the future, but kept getting tripped up by its own internal conflicts. The story of the Chinese Revolution is a story of a nation that was trying to find its way out of the past and into the future, but kept getting tripped up by its own internal conflicts. The legacy of the Chinese Revolution is also a global one. The victory of the communists in China had a profound impact on the Cold War. It was a huge blow to the United States and its allies, and it was a huge victory for the Soviet Union and its allies. The victory of the communists in China also had a profound impact on the rest of the world. It inspired other revolutionary movements in Asia, Africa, and Latin America, and it was a sign that a new, more powerful, and more confident China was now on the world stage. The revolution was not just a Chinese story, it was a global story. It was a story of a nation that was trying to find its way out of the past and into the future, but kept getting tripped up by its own internal conflicts. The story of the Chinese Revolution, a journey of more than a century, is a story that is still being written. It is a story of a nation that has gone from a dying empire to a global superpower, a story of a people that has gone from a subject of a foreign power to a master of its own destiny. It is a story that is still being debated and still being lived. The journey we have taken together has been a long one, from the crumbling walls of the Forbidden City to the proclamation on Tiananmen Gate, and it is here, in the quiet aftermath of that final, grand moment, that our history comes to a rest. The echoes of the past can still be heard, like the distant rustle of silk robes and the soft, hurried whispers of a world now gone. But those sounds are fading, becoming a part of a larger, more peaceful silence. The long, chaotic tale of a nation's struggle has settled into the quiet, starlit night. The turmoil of 100 years, the clash of armies, and the clash of ideas have all faded into the gentle hum of the past. The great historical figures, the emperors and generals, the revolutionaries and the students, they too have become a part of the quiet, winding river of time. Their stories and the nation's story have found their final rest, their struggles now a soft and distant memory. And so, the story of the revolution, a story of a nation that was trying to find its way, gently sinks into legend, into a quiet and peaceful sleep. End of script. Sweet dreams.